Welcome to Olicana Music. My name is Alistair. In this week's lesson, we're going to talk about how to mix major and minor pentatonic scales. This iconic blending of scales plays off the idea of tension and release, and it's been made famous by players like Eric Clapton, John Mayer, and Stevie Ray Vaughan. Once you get to grips with mixing major and minor pentatonic scales, it's going to become an essential part of your improvisational toolkits. In the lesson, we'll cover why mixing these scales sounds so good, and then we'll talk about how to do it generally, and then we'll talk about how you can apply these concepts in a blues, which is a little more advanced. Stick around to the end of the lesson and I'll show you an exercise that you can use to implement these ideas with. With that out of the way, let's get on with the lesson. As a guitar player, you should already be familiar with the minor pentatonic scale. It's usually the first scale that beginners learn and is essential vocabulary for most genres of guitar-based music. If you're a little more advanced, you might have come across the major pentatonic scale. This is like the mirror image to the minor pentatonic scale. It's its major counterpart. If you have learned to improvise a little bit with both of these scales, now's a great time to learn how to blend the two and switch between them in a solo. This trick sounds so good because it plays off of the idea of tension and release. If you only stick to one scale in your solo, the listener is quickly going to become accustomed to it. The pentatonic scale, whether it's major or minor, only has 5 notes in it, and all 5 of those notes are fairly consonant, and therefore it's harder to inject tension into your solos just using these 5 notes alone. You can obviously mediate this problem with slides and bends and other articulations, but another approach is actually to just mix these two scales together. You don't need to learn any new tricks, you just need to learn when to switch between the two ideas to ramp up the tension or to add some release again. A great example of mixing pentatonic scales in action is Eric Clapton's solo on Crossroads. On the 1 chord, he plays the major pentatonic scale, and then when he moves to the 4 chord, he actually plays the minor pentatonic scale. By switching scales, he adds contrast for the listener. He injects tension into the solo that wouldn't otherwise have been there. He then releases that tension later in the 12-bar progression when he returns to the major pentatonic scale. Switching scales creates a cycle of tension and release, and it's this cycle of tension and release that makes Clapton's solo on Crossroads sound so good. If you're going to try mixing these two scales together, it's useful to know ahead of time when it's going to sound good and when it's maybe not such a good idea. Without going too far into the theory weeds, the best time to kind of apply this is songs in a major key, or when the key is kind of ambiguous, so a blues or a classic rock song are good examples of those kind of areas where you could try this. The best way to figure it out, obviously, is experimentation, but starting with songs in a major key is a great place to begin. I think of it this way: the major pentatonic scale is an extremely consonant scale. It's very hard to inject tension using just that scale alone. You can base a solo around that scale, and when you want to ramp up the intensity, you can switch to the minor pentatonic scale. This is going to inject tension. I don't find this idea works the other way around. In a song in a minor key, you can obviously use the minor pentatonic scale to improvise over the top of it. You can't really switch to the major pentatonic scale in those circumstances to add a little bit of spice. It just doesn't really sound that good, in my opinion. I also haven't been able to find any examples of it being done in popular music, and that may be an indicator that other people tend to agree with me. Of course, you should experiment yourself. Try switching pentatonic scales in a song in a minor key, and decide for yourself if you like the sound of it. But in my opinion, it doesn't really work. So now you know generally when to use this concept. It works well in songs in a major key or in songs where the key is a little bit ambiguous. We're going to learn more specifically about what you should be doing to improvise with it. As I said earlier, this whole idea plays off of the idea of tension and release. So what you should be doing is using the cycle of tension release in the chord progression to help guide your improvisation. All chord progressions follow a cycle of tension and release. A simple rule of thumb is to just follow that tension and release cycle in the chord progression with your solo. Take the following chord progression, for example. It goes 1, which is C, and then 4, which is F, and then it's going to have 6, which is A minor, and then 5, which is G. So it's a 1, 4, 6, 5 in the key of C. The 1 chord, it doesn't have very much tension in it. And that's because it's home bass, and therefore we're settled, we're at home, there's not much tension. When we move to the 4 chord, this is the subdominant chord, and because it's a subdominant chord, there's a little bit more tension there. We've moved a little further away from home bass, and therefore there's a lot more tension. When we go to the 6 chord, This is a tonic chord, but it's not a home chord anymore. So it's got less tension than the subdominant chord, but a little more than our 1 chord. And when we go to that 5 chord, that is where our tension peaks, and this has got maximal tension. It is the dominant chord of the key. If I play it as a dominant 7, loads of tension, which is then released when I go back to 1. You can try to match the cycle of tension and release in the chord progression with your solo. So that means using the major pentatonic scale over tonic chords, so that's the 1 chord, the 6 chord, and the 3 chord. And then you can use the minor pentatonic scale over subdominant and dominant chords, or at the cadence of the chord progression, so where the chord progression comes back round on itself. That's usually a point in the chord progression where there's a lot of tension, and therefore, regardless of what chord is underneath, because it's the cadence, you can kind of get away with using the minor pentatonic scale there. Let's have a listen to what that would sound like. First, I'm going to do the opposite of what I just described. I'm going to use the minor pentatonic scale for the majority of the solo, and then at the cadence of the chord progression, I'm going to switch to the major pentatonic scale. What do you think of that? Let's try it the other way around now. I'm going to use the major pentatonic scale for the majority of the solo, and then I'm going to switch to the minor pentatonic scale at the cadence of the chord progression. Let me know in the comments which one you prefer. For me, it's definitely the second one. This is the general approach that I like to take if I'm going to mix pentatonic scales. I like to play the major pentatonic scale as the core component of my solo, but at points where I want the tension to peak, so for example at the cadence of the chord progression, I like to switch to the minor pentatonic scale to inject that little bit of bluesiness, and that just peaks the tension up a little bit, and that sounds really good in my opinion. In this example, we've just talked about using it on the cadence, but actually you could experiment with doing this over any chord in the chord progression. So it'd be really wise to take a chord progression and experiment, okay, over the 1 chord, what does it sound like when I use the major pentatonic scale? What does it sound like when I use the minor pentatonic scale? Repeat that with the 2 chord, repeat that with the 3 chord, repeat that with the 4 chord, and so on, until you know on each chord that is in the key, how does the major pentatonic scale sound and how does the minor pentatonic scale sound? You can then utilize the ones that you like the sound of, and you can obviously bin the ones that you don't like the sound of. If you want some backing tracks that you can practice that idea with, you can find them all in the lesson pack for this lesson on my website, olicanamusic.com. The link is in the description. The lesson pack has detailed practice notes from this lesson. It also has obviously the backing track, as we just said, to practice these ideas with, and the main backing track that you can use to practice mixing the pentatonic scales with generally. Link is in the description. Check it out if that's something that'd be interesting to you. Let's take this idea a step further now. We're going to tease the listener a little bit with the minor third. As I said earlier, the major pentatonic scale is very consonant, and in some people's opinion, it's kind of bland because there's no tension in it. And the thing is, you could make the analogy that it's a bit like somebody making you smile all the time. It's this permanently happy sound that has no reflection on reality, essentially, because real life isn't happy all the time. Sometimes we have moments that are tinged with sadness. Even the best moments can sometimes be tinged with a little bit of sadness. And music is about expressing emotion and all of those things. It's trying to communicate through sound, essentially. How can you inject that little bit of reality into your playing? How can you show the listener that, hey, although this is a major sound and this is the major pentatonic scale, how can I show you that there's actually a little bit more going on behind the scenes? The minor third is a great way to do this. By adding the minor third to your major pentatonic scale, you can add that little tinge of sadness that just says, hey, there's something a little bit more interesting going on. There's a little more tension here than I want to let you onto. It's obviously mostly consonant, but that minor third just peeking its way in occasionally adds that little like speck of tension that keeps the listener's ear engaged, and they go, hey, there's something going on here. It's not just super consonant, super happy major pentatonic scale. There is some other color in here that is making things a little bit more interesting to listen to. You could play a whole solo that uses the major pentatonic scale, just hinting the minor third occasionally throughout it. And then if you really want to slam your point home at the climax of your solo, you switch to the minor pentatonic scale like we just discussed. And because you've been teasing the listener with that minor third the whole time, when they finally get that whole minor sound over the major progression, that really bluesy effect, it's going to be really satisfying, and the tension is going to absolutely peak at that point. And then when you come back to the major pentatonic scale at the end, it's going to have that sense of rest, that sense of release, and it'll be really satisfying for the person listening. This is where mixing the major and minor pentatonic scales, in my opinion, becomes really exciting, and it's possibly at its best. Let's have a listen to what that might sound like. With major keys out of the way, let's talk about using this in a blues like Crossroads. The guidelines for using this idea in a blues are actually very similar for what we've just discussed in a major key. You want to follow the cycle of tension and release in the chord progression, and you can obviously tease the listener with the minor third throughout. But you can actually be a little bit more flexible about where you switch scales, so we're going to talk about that as well in a minute. The easiest way to get started using this in blues is, as I said, to use the rules that we just discussed a minute ago. So you can use your major pentatonic scale over the 1 chord, and then your minor pentatonic scale would work over the 4 chord and the 5 chord, because they are the subdominant and the dominant chords. Here's what that would sound like. Blues is really interesting though, because you can actually use any scale over any chord. So you could use the major pentatonic scale on any chord or the minor pentatonic scale on any chord. Bear in mind this only works for major blues because of the dominant 7th chord that is there. If you try to do this on a minor blues, I feel that you run into the same issues that you have with songs in a minor key generally. It just kind of grates and doesn't really work that well. But on a major blues, you can use either the major pentatonic scale or the minor pentatonic scale over any of the chords. There is an important caveat here though. If you're going to use the major pentatonic scale on the 4 or the 5 chord of your 12-bar blues, you need to use the same major pentatonic scale as the tonic of the chord. So what do I mean by that? So let's say you've got a blues in A. So our 1 chord in a blues in A is going to be A7, and then our 4 chord is going to be D7, and then our 5 chord is going to be E7. Over our A7 chord, I could use A major pentatonic. The tonic of the scale matches the tonic of the chord. So A7, A major pentatonic scale. When I go to my 4 chord though, I can't keep using the A major pentatonic scale if I want to sound authentic. What you should do is you should follow the chord change. So on the D7 chord, you should use the D major pentatonic scale. The tonic of the scale and the tonic of the chord match. And likewise, when you go to the 5 chord, our E7 chord, you should use the E major pentatonic scale. The tonic of the scale and the tonic of the chord are the same. We'll talk more about this in an upcoming lesson, so get subscribed and hit the notification bell if you'd like to see that. It's called Playing the Changes, and it's a really important aspect of blues playing if you want to sound authentic. Let's have a listen to what that might sound like if you're a little more flexible with your scale choices over a 12-bar blues. Let's talk about an exercise that you can use to get started learning how to mix the major and minor pentatonic scales. The easiest exercise you could do, where you don't have to think about what the chord changes are and you don't have to worry about following the chord with the scale or anything like that, is just to stick on a backing track in a major key and then just switch scales when you feel like it. Start with the major pentatonic scale, and when you're bored, switch to the minor pentatonic scale. Keep switching as and when you feel, and the purpose of this is to just get your ear accustomed to the idea of switching between these scales in a major context, and to pay attention to what you like the sound of. Pay attention to whether you like the sound of switching the scales at all. When in the chord progression do you like the sound of switching scales? It's just an experiment. You just sit down, you mess around with it, you can't go wrong with it, and you just change scales when you feel. Here's an example of that exercise in action. I think, like most things music, less is more. The drama and the tension of switching pentatonic scales is really the product of surprise. If you're continually switching between these scales in your solo, the listener is going to get accustomed to the fact you're switching, and therefore the benefits afforded of tension and release are kind of lost because they're predictable. It's much better to just kind of do it once and just surprise them out of the blue. It's like, whoa, wasn't expecting the minor pentatonic scale there. Wow, that sounded bluesy and interesting and a little bit different. That's a much more effective way of doing it. And if you want to prime them a little bit and kind of say, hey, something more afoot is going on, you can obviously tease them with the minor third, as we talked about earlier. Check out the lesson pack to get more exercises that you can use to incorporate this concept into your own playing. And of course, it includes all the backing tracks that I've used in the lesson today and the backing tracks for experimenting with the different chord types when you're switching pentatonic scales. That's it for this lesson. Thanks for watching. If you learned something, please leave the video a like and maybe share the video with any guitar players that you think might find it useful. And I'll see you for our lesson next Saturday.